We'll begin with Rand and me, and then Susan. Rand?
Thank you very much, Guy.
We will also take questions at the end. We'll pass around cards, and if you can write your questions down and pass them forward, we'll pick out the easiest ones.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I want to do today is talk about the policy framework and some of the policy issue areas that we need to begin to focus on in Homeland Security. I think it's interesting to note that really since 9/11, and certainly as a result of the 9/11 Commission report, we have had a drumbeat of expert advice that we need to pay attention to Homeland Security as part of a comprehensive approach to dealing with bin Laden and terrorism as bin Laden has espoused. But at the same time, although we had a big dust-up in the 2002 election on the issue of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, a false issue having to do with labor, we essentially forgot about it immediately after the organization of the department until Katrina reminded everybody that what was supposed to be happening under the notion of Homeland Security, including disaster assistance, was simply not only not improved from where we left off at the end of the Clinton administration, but in fact it had deteriorated so significantly that a catastrophe of the level of Katrina was that much worse. I think that there are four fundamental reasons for why this stepping back has occurred. As most of you know, when the Homeland Security bill was put forward by Senator Lieberman after the 9/11 incident, it was basically opposed by the administration until they realized that there was a veto-proof majority in the Congress that was going to see this through, and then suddenly decided that they better take over the process and came up with their own set of proposals for it. But that didn't change their approach to this, which was one of neglect and disregard. They set up a process to create the Department of Homeland Security. It was run offline while Tom Ridge was the Homeland Security advisor in the White House. When he was designated to become the next cabinet secretary in December, although he was nominally responsible for supervising the transition teams reported to him, and he basically threw everything out that they had come up with and said, let's start over. So that in 2003, when the department was supposed to stand up, he was probably the lone member of the Department of Homeland Security in any leadership position, and it took them quite some time to fill all of those positions. But as I said, I think there are four fundamental reasons that this administration and conservatives have a problem with Homeland Security. First of all, it's going to involve spending more money domestically. Secondly, it's going to involve some expansion of government. Third, and more importantly, it's going to mean that there's going to have to be some regulation, rulemaking, guidelines that are going to affect the private sector, because it has to be done in combination with the private sector. And last, and perhaps most important and never talked about, if you think about where the threats actually exist in this country, they exist in urban areas. And urban areas are progressive constituencies. And so the dollars spent and the programs implemented would be counter to where conservatives would like to ensure that resources flow. And so what resources they are distributed more broadly, and as many of you know, the per capita funding for Wyoming is higher than the per capita funding for New York. And we find ourselves in that situation. So based on that, we still lack a comprehensive threat assessment. We still lack a baseline study of what capabilities exist within the United States. We still lack a set of requirements to weigh against the baseline in order to see whether and where we want to go in terms of developing this. All of the basic ingredients of a strategy are lacking. There's a strategy, but it's a rhetorical strategy. It doesn't really have anything behind it, and the Department of Homeland Security has done little to nothing to make that real. There's still a lack of priorities. People don't know what we need to do. Most importantly, there's no guidance, and as a result, when progressives in Congress look at issues like this, it's very difficult to sort through what the priorities ought to be because there's no base in order to measure it against. Having said that, I think that if you ask the expert community and you ask the American people, there's a clear sense that there will be another attack. In fact, the administration says that there will be another attack, and it's a question of when and not if. So it seems to me that progressives have to begin to stand up and talk about what it is we need to do. There is no such thing as a perfect defense. We are not going to be able to cover everything, but we can at least do what we need to do in terms of trying to prevent or mitigate the worst kinds of things that might happen. And in that regard, I think that what we need to be thinking about is the fact that most of the threats are going to be in urban environments, and in recognizing that, we're going to have a federal government that's prepared to work with states and cities to develop plans within urban environments that are both prevention, protection, and threat, or I should say attack mitigation. That means that we're going to have to say that the top 150 cities are going to have to be a priority planning area, and the federal government is going to have to work with them. And we're going to have to decide what are the minimum essential capabilities that we want to protect in order to have the best chance that if there is an attack, the catastrophic results of that are going to be mitigated. That's going to mean that there has to be a plan, there has to be a set of equipment that is appropriate to those cities, that there are communications that can talk with everybody, that there is an exercise program that allows those capabilities to be exercised, that there is a chemical, biological, and nuclear surveillance system that at least provides some possibility of detecting those systems if they become present in these environments, and there has to be an intel sharing program. Those are the simple, basic ingredients for any urban plan. Each plan will be different, but we need to have that template, and we need to have the cities working toward it, and the federal government has to be a partner in helping the cities to develop that. With respect to the private sector, many of these sites are going to be in private hands, and there has to be a way in which the private sector becomes part of the ability to protect themselves and to respond if there is an attack. As I said, there's going to be some rulemaking, there's going to be some regulations in association with that. The private sector can be a contributor to making those plans better, and they can buy into reducing the cost to themselves by making sure that the planning that's done is smart. We can work on insurance plans so that the private sector, pay into insurance pools and are judged by the insurance companies as to whether or not their protection plans, in fact, are adequate and worthy of getting some degree of insurance, and we can require that they have that insurance depending upon where they are and what sector they're in. But in the end, we're still going to have to face the fact that there has to be a federal backup, just as there was with respect to 9/11 in the case of a catastrophic event. Finally, with respect to the federal government, as I said earlier, they're going to have to work with the state and local governments. They're going to have to provide guidelines and requirements with the understanding that no one size fits all. We're going to have a FEMA that's clearly better able to function than it is today, and that probably means an independent cabinet-level FEMA rather than being part of the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to have to be prepared to increase the amount of funding that the federal government spends on these issues. Homeland security is a national security issue. National security is a federal government funding responsibility. States and localities can be asked to contribute, but in the end, the federal government is going to have to begin to be a participant. The current budget is about $40 billion. There probably is a need to increase that budget by 20%. In a book that a friend of mine, Dick Clark, and I did called The Forgotten Homeland, there's a $23 billion budget involved there, and it would involve beefing up ports, transport, the power system in chemical, biological, and nuclear facilities in order to take on the first tasks, the highest priority, the greatest, the sites that are the greatest likelihood of the most catastrophic damage. This is something that we're going to have to make a national decision about as to whether or not it ought to be paid above the levels or whether it ought to be paid in trade-offs. We propose in the book, and Susan is going to talk about that a little bit as well, that there are opportunities for trade-offs across the national security budget, and that there are weapon systems in the Pentagon that Donald Rumsfeld wanted to cancel that are available still as opportunities for trade-offs. Taking money out of the Defense Department, given the way in which the programs are funded, is always a challenge. But if the President is willing to lead, if this is going to be a serious national security debate, then there are possibilities there in that regard. I've gone over a lot of material very briefly. We can talk about more in detail, but let me stop there and turn it over.
Thanks, Rand. The last 3 federal elections have been decided on national security issues, with the Democrats losing 2 of them. In 2004, according to the ABC News poll, 49% of voters trusted only George Bush to protect them against terrorism, compared to 31% that trusted only John Kerry. And of that 49% that trusted only Bush, 97% voted for him, thus accounting for 48% of his total vote. Pick up a few percent on other issues and you've won the election. In 2006, which is a good election for us, Iraq dominated. According to the Greenberg-Quinlan poll, 41% said that Iraq was the #1 priority voting issue. That broke well for Democrats. But the second highest priority for voters was protecting America against terrorism. 22% said that was the #1 issue. And of that 22%, voters broke 74-24 for the Republicans. Now, if you lose 22% by a 50-point margin, you have an 11-point headwind that you've got to overcome. I'm going to talk about 2 polls that I've funded, one through the Sierra Club in 2005 and the other one through National Security Network just last week. Both were done by Jeff Guerin of Hart Research, a very well-respected pollster, both on protecting America against terrorism issues. This poll reveals that currently Democrats, if you voted for Congress today, if you ask people who would they vote for, Democrats have a 15-point advantage on Republicans, which is double what they had in November of 2006. But if you ask them if they were voting on who could protect them against terrorism, that 15-point advantage completely disappears. So if there's any incident, anything that raises the profile of terrorism between now and 2008, whatever advantage the Democrats currently have is going to be gone. Evan Bayh said 2 years ago, if the American people don't trust us with their lives, they're unlikely to trust us with anything else. The only advantage the Bush and the Republicans have on Democrats is national security. They trail Democrats by 20 points on everything else. If we want to win elections consistently, we have to take away this advantage. We don't have to win this issue, but we need to neutralize it. Now, the opportunity is here because the Bush-Republican record on protecting America is worse than dismal. Cargo containers have been described as the most effective nuclear delivery system ever invented. 6 years after 9/11, only 4% of cargo containers are inspected. It should be 100%. It could be 100%. There are 15,000 chemical plants in America storing large amounts of hazardous materials, yet there are no federal security standards. There are not even any security assessments. According to the EPA, 823 of these facilities exist in large population areas where a single terrorist incident could result in 100,000 to 1 million deaths. Biological agents are even more dangerous. Again, no federal oversight. Commercial airliners, we all go through the cattle prod checks. America spends more than $4 billion searching passengers, while the same airplanes inspect only 5% of the cargo on the same planes. Does that make any sense? Shoulder-fired missiles, there are 50,000 loose in the world. They're available on the black market. There have already been attempts to smuggle them into the United States, and yet American commercial planes have no protection, as do military planes, against these devices, and as Israel and Great Britain have on their commercial planes. First responders are severely underfunded. Nuclear materials, in the former Soviet republics, the budget for Nunn-Lugar funds have been cut, and in the 2008 recommended budget by Bush, they would be further cut. Pointing out these dangerous situations is not fear-mongering, but ignoring them would simply reinforce the public's perception that Democrats don't care about national security. We have an incredible opportunity now to erase this historic 20-point advantage on national security, and the public is ready for it. The public remains extremely sensitive to protecting America against terrorism. In fact, they think it's more important today than they did 2 years ago. Carol, can we have the first slide? A 2005 poll, 48% said it was very likely that we'd have another major terrorist attack. Today, as of last week, 57%. Next slide. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important are the following issues? Well, Iraq emerges as the most important issue among voters, with a mean average of 8.1 on a 10-point scale. But the second most important issue is homeland security and protecting America from terrorism, ahead of education, health care, the federal budget, and global warming. When we asked voters what they thought was effective in protecting America from terrorism, Republican priorities are revealed as totally out of whack with voter priorities. Okay, that's a little bit small. In fact, I can't even read it from the side, but I think I know it. When we asked people, we gave them a list of 12 different ideas about how to protect America against terrorism, and asked them what they thought was very important or very effective. The first issue is protecting against biological agents. I can't even read it here. What's that? Yeah, or X-ray, yeah, okay, X-ray. But they're all the kind of issues I talked about, protecting chemical plants, protecting nuclear plants, protecting commercial aircraft. What's on the bottom of the list? What do people think is least effective in protecting America against terrorism? The war in Iraq. And the second least effective is a Patriot Act. And this is, by the way, consistent. We got the same results in 2005. So the public doesn't buy the Republican priorities about how to protect America. Now, there's a big upside for Democrats if they grab this issue. Next one. We asked this question. The Democrats pledged to immediately implement the recommendations of the independent bipartisan 9/11 Commission. How would you feel about Democrats if they actually do it? Do you consider it important? 68% say it's very important that Democrats follow through on their promises. 16% fairly important. 84% consider this very important. Big upside. By the way, there's a subset of information which we're not showing here. This is consistent not only among Democrats. 69% of Democrats say it's very important. 73% of independents say it's very important. And 63% of Republicans say it's very important. So you've got a tripartisan agreement about the importance of this. There's a big downside if the Democrats don't do it. Next slide, Carol. Oh, well, this is a different slide. We asked people, what are you worried about? The Democrats spending too much money on these issues or too little money? Well, 35% are concerned that Democrats are going to spend too much money on Homeland Security. 49% are afraid they won't spend enough. Next slide. Oh, here's the downside. Supposing you learned the Democratic Congress had taken action to pass. Oh, this is the upside. We got an upside, we got a downside. Had taken action to pass and fund many of the measures to help protect America from terrorism after the Republicans neglected to do so when they were in control of Congress. How would this make you feel about the Democratic Congress? 74% say more favorable. Okay, let's see the downside side. Okay, on the other hand, suppose you learned that they didn't fully fund many of these measures. How would you feel about the Democratic Congress? Much less favorable, 31, somewhat less favorable, 38. 69% less favorable. So there's a big downside. Let's do 5A. It's a hard one to see. This one asked, are Democrats spending too much time or not enough time on various issues? Well, on Iraq, 30% say too much time, too much attention. 37% say not enough attention. So the Democrats roughly have it right with the public. But go down to the bottom. Protecting America against terrorism, too much time, 9%. Too little time, 51%. The public thinks this is the biggest neglected issue, and guess what? They're right. Now, is it possible for Democrats to outframe Republicans? We all, concede that Karl Rove can be a genius in framing. Can Democrats outframe this issue? Let's go to the next one. We tried 3 different frames. I'm going to show you one of them. We tried a frame written by Jeff Guerin. We tried one written by my friend George Lakoff and one written by me, and then we all took bets on which one would win. This is the one that won. It happens to be mine. But they all won. They all won by 2-1. All the different frames won. The Democratic frame won by more than 2-1. This one won by 68-26. Can you read it? Okay, I can't read it either. Let's see. This one essentially takes the Republican frame, the red meat frame. You got to go back, Carol. You got the wrong slide up. It's a red meat frame about how we have to fight them over there so they don't get here, and we've got to hunt them down and kill them, and we've got to use law enforcement, blah, blah, blah. The military response. The Democratic frame, Statement B, which we don't identify here as a Democratic frame, says we've got to invest in the kind of things that I've been talking about here today, and that's a high priority. We can't ignore that. So the Democratic frame went 68-26. Now, I'd like to show one more visual. This is a television ad. A year ago, Wes Boyd and I constructed a national campaign on these issues, which we got funded and ran out through Americans United, and we did a number of TV ads. And I want to show you a TV ad that we did on this issue to show you that we can make this stuff very visual, very grabby. This particular one got a ton of earned media. We've got on a lot of TV shows, and so the value of the ad buy was multiplied many times over. Go ahead, run it.
Thousands of containers hit our ports each day. I know. I unload them. After 9/11, I thought the president and his backers
He needs a little thing.
get serious about security. 4 years later, terrorists can still put a dirty bomb in one of these, and only 1 in 20 will be inspected. For the other 19, this is what stands between us and them.
Tell the president and his backers in Congress it's time for a change. 100% inspections, a real security plan now.
Now this is that little fastener. We call this ad seals. This is a seal. We handed out 1,000 of these. Every congressperson and staffer got one of these. We handed them out to the press. And in our demonstration, we took a little, see, these are just children's. And these children cut right through them. Children's scissors. And that's the only thing keeping those containers locked. It would be a strategic blunder of the highest magnitude for Democrats to miss the opportunity to inflict serious damage to Republicans on the only issue that they cannot survive without. Republicans are playing a very weak hand on security, but they play it. They don't sit on it, and they don't fold it. Democrats have a strong hand to play on security, but they need to play it for all it's worth, which is a lot. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Shaer, and I guess I'm the, after the experts, I'm the grassroots piece to this. I know everybody who comes to Take Back America gets up every day to try to see what they can do to make this place, this country, a better place. And so all of the things you've heard, I'd like to add a little bit more and then give you some ideas on what you can do. And because I come from the grassroots, we're going to have paper to hand out so that when you go home, you'll have it very clearly what you can do. And if you stay here till the very end and don't run off to try to get a seat from Barack Obama, and you sign our pledge about not bombing Iran, we'll give you a special token, our magic pen, that I'm going to explain to you. Well, you've heard a lot of bad news up here, and I hope that what I'm going to talk about is the bad news, good news story. And I like to think about decades ago when FDR said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so for decades, we all believed in that, and we were a very strong country. We felt strong in our beliefs, and we were fearless in many, many ways, and maybe just a little bit too much fearless. But recently, that has changed, and you've all heard this quote many times before. And listen carefully. America must not ignore the threat garnering against us. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. Now that was the ultimate in fear-mongering, and that was said by our president and repeated by anyone who could repeat it, including Condi Rice many times. But what this really means for all of us, what this means for your friends and your families and the people who you're trying to energize to be more progressive, is that fear actually disables rational thinking. And if any of you have read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, who also wrote The Tipping Point, he describes that when you're in a state of fear, your heart pounds and your adrenaline pumps, and when you're like that, you make mistakes. People make mistakes. And so what happens is that we see guns where there are no guns, we misread facial expressions, and we can come to some wrong conclusions. And that has really happened when you think about it in this country since 9/11. We have been in this artificially prolonged state of fear. And the government has used this to their advantage, and they have promoted a very un-American agenda, one when we were in that state of not fearing that we would not have allowed to happen. We have allowed these quick draw military solutions that we would have not allowed before. We would have opted for diplomacy. In fact, we would have demanded it. So I wanted to say just a few things about what terrorism is. So when you go out to talk to your friends, and remember, as progressives, we're often put down because we lecture to our friends about what the statistics are and what the polls say and what the facts are, and we're right. But you really have to talk to them more about where their fears are and where they're living, and so you have to think about what terrorism is. So one thing we can't do is have a war on terror. It's like having a war on drugs. We've never really actually defined what drugs are. You know, is it aspirin or is it something that comes over the border? And having a war on terror just gives us this image of lots and lots of military. But a couple of truths you should know. There are other things worse than terrorism. Global climate change, nuclear destruction. This could end the world as we know it. Terrorism might do it bit by bit and leave us in a state of fear, but truthfully, climate change and nuclear destruction is more important. And actually, numerically speaking, although it's really hard to talk about numbers when you're talking about victims and people dying, many fewer people die from acts of terrorism than by things like malnutrition. It's interesting that the government really does promote a lot of volunteerism around some of these issues, and for those of you who watch American Idol, and I know some of you do, they had to go on the air and try to get people to get money for children who are dying of malaria, because it's something that really could be solved, and 2,000 children a day die from malaria. So terrorism is terrible, but it is not a thing that we should have a war over. One of the things that has also happened to us is that we think terrorism is everywhere. But another little known fact is that the State Department, who has put out a measure of terrorism for decades, actually changed the definition of terrorism in 2003 so that the numbers have skyrocketed, when in fact when the definition that they used before was quite different. So what has the government response been? Well, you have heard some of the examples of what they have done. And I'd like to use, and I think this is something that you can use for your friends, is that our government says that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Now, you've probably heard that before, but that is never more present than it is now. And that we use military force or the threat of military force for everything. So what has happened is that the Pentagon has received this huge blank check. And I often do not use that phrase, blank check, if there are a lot of really young people in the room, because I'm told young people don't use checks. But if you do think of a blank check, well, they've got one. And it is so big that they have not passed audits until they put the budget for Iraq and Afghanistan into the military budget, which they didn't until this current budget they're about to vote on. There was no way to look at it at all. This magic pen I told you about, that if you sign the petition you'll get, was really invented by our friend and colleague, Business Leaders for Sensible Priorities and True Majority. Wave your hand, Dwayne. Ben and Jerry's of the food. And WAND has them as well. And we have the global military spending versus the axis of evil and other folks. And we also have how much we spend and how much we'd like to spend on other things. So this is something that you can pull out at dinner parties and such, and it quite accentuates your heartfelt and hard facts about these things. One last point about terrorism, and before I tell you some of the options for change. And this is another thing that I think is good to share, that since 9/11, most of the victims of terrorism have largely been Muslim, and most of them have been in Iraq. So for the government to put us in a paralyzed state of fear has not only been wrong, but it's been stupid. Okay, so what do we do? You've heard this. We need a security policy that matches the problem. And so what has happened is that people, since 9/11, have actually grown into this, and the polls demonstrate that, as Guy has shown you. And right now, the polls also show that what the American people want is preparedness and accountability. And preparedness is the response to terrorism, and it's the homeland security part of preparedness. It's not necessarily preparing a military to go out and fight a whole bunch of wars. And in a very big dramatic shift recently, we all have known and have been saying since the war in Iraq started that it was making us less secure. But the fact is now the American people believe it as well. And that shift is so dramatic, it's well over 60% of the American people believe that. And there's a huge gender position in this polling that shows that even more and more women believe this than men, which has significant ramifications for the election for next year. So, what can we do? We have at Take Back America, and you should look at people's name tags and check them out, a lot of state legislators here. And you've heard but from both of our experts that we need Homeland Security. Well, Homeland Security is in your states. And a lot of the states do need to take responsibility for that, but they also need the money for it, as we've heard. I want to mention a couple of other things in addition to what Rand has mentioned that the states need to do, because you can go back to your states and ask your state legislators about these issues. And I want to mention first that Chertoff, Homeland Security Administrator, Advisor, Czar, whatever he is, spoke to a bunch of state legislators a number of years ago, and he gave a long list of things that they had done, and it was a long list, but it was all in airports. And as you heard, it was all about us, the passengers. It was nothing about anything else. There is another issue called Real ID. How many of you have heard of it? Pretty soon, if you don't have a Real ID, and the deadline is fast approaching, 2008, the final date, 2013, you will not be able to get Social Security, you'll not be able to fly in a plane, you will not be able to do anything that has anything to do with the federal government, and you know that's practically everything. And that is in order to get at terrorists. And I've just explained the terrorists are, well, it's not a nuclear weapon. So this issue is actually going to bankrupt the states, because the federal government has only put $50 million into it, and it's been estimated to cost $11 billion. So they asked for it, but you get the price tag. Another thing you can ask your state legislators about is something called Project BioShield, which is supposed to protect the chemical plants. Chemical plants are all over this country, most of them in urban areas. And this Project BioShield was started after 9/11, but nothing has been done about that either. Well, lately there has been a lot of interest in these issues, not only in the local press, but the issues of priorities and how we spend our money is finally making it to the front pages. WAND, my organization, Women's Action for New Directions, has been working on this for 15 years, and we have been trying to convince people that we really are spending an excessive amount of money on the military budget, and this hammer that we have is really not working. But what we need is something like Homeland Security, and we need prevention. I read an article in the New York Times by David Unger, who is the senior editorial writer for Foreign Affairs, and he said, first, we should absolutely allocate the money for Homeland Security, not for military, but that the Homeland Security Department uses, and I love this phrase, you can borrow this, quote him, quote me, quote whoever you want, that the government uses the dartboard plus pork approach. Imagine the dartboard, a little bit of pork, that's where you got your Homeland Security. Another quote I read was that there's not much money in Homeland Security yet, but there is money, so somebody's going to be going after it, and you know it's not for the right reasons. So the 9/11 Commission and the Iraq Study Group actually, I mean, we've been saying all this for a long time, but two very renowned and respected groups have given the administration a lot of information to go on, as well as giving Congress. We've all seen that Congress has moved forward in the last couple of months with the change, not as fast as we'd like, but they are moving forward. And the 9/11 Commission also emphasized that we need to be more steadfast on preparedness and Homeland Security. So I'm going to mention two things to you that you can talk about when you go home. One of them was mentioned by Lynn Woolsey yesterday. It's called Smart Security. It's something she's been proposing. We all know and love Lynn Woolsey, right? And Smart Security, we're going to be handing out a copy of this, so I don't have to read to you exactly what it is. But there are 7 steps for a national strategy that focuses on nonproliferation, conflict prevention, international diplomacy, and multilateralism, all those things that we love. But what it really does is it helps everybody in Congress look at every single piece of legislation that comes through that has to do with Homeland Security or with any kind of security and measure it against these 7 steps to see if it will actually do those things. And if it doesn't, then it might be irrelevant. So something like this Real ID card that was added onto the funding for Katrina or the funding for one of the disasters, and maybe it was the tsunami disaster, might not have passed that test. The second one is something called the Unified Security Budget. Now you imagine your own budget at home, and let's say at home somebody's in charge of getting the locks on the door and the security system, and somebody else has their entertainment budget so you can entertain your friends and neighbors so that they don't hate you and attack you, and the outside budget is for putting up a wired fence or a barbed wire fence or something like that, and everybody in the family is in charge of a different thing. That wouldn't work so well. It's not coordinated. And that's what we have in Congress. We have lots of different budgets, lots of different committees, and they do not work together. But we have, and we'll hand out for you, a brief copy of the Unified Security Budget, which explains how we can put these budgets together, how we can measure them, and how Congress can look at them all of a piece so that the money is not wasted. It says that we can make $50 billion worth of cuts, and it mentions a couple places where we can cut them. Now, whenever we mention cuts in Cold War weapons, somebody gets nervous, and they say it can't be done, and the candidates won't do it. But I want to point out to you that our friends, the Business Leaders for Sensible Priorities, have been out on the trail talking to the candidates. And today, when you hear the candidates, or tomorrow, you can ask them this question, because they've been asking them wherever they go, and they've been getting them to change their mind. So I'm going to end with this good news. Joe Biden in December said, "I know you asked about reducing the Pentagon budget, but we can fix problems by eliminating tax cuts for the wealthy." 6 months later, he says, "Oh, we should cut Star Wars, the Osprey, the F-22. He changed his mind. Barack Obama, he said that he would consider shifting Pentagon needs maybe in February of 2007, and by June he was saying that we have to emphasize shifting and budget priorities. And Hillary Clinton is the same, as well as all the other candidates. So within months, by asking questions and showing the information to the presidential candidates, we were actually able, or lots of people on the ground were actually able to change their mind. And so this is my important message. We can do this. We can do this with our friends and neighbors. We can do this with the candidates, and we really have to do that. Right now, 2/3 of the American people say that the United States government play on people's fears too much in justifying foreign policy. You heard that the next election is going to be about foreign policy, so we need to use that to our advantage. Because in addition to what FDR said about fear, he also said we have the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And that's what we need to do. Thank you.
No written questions have reached me, so would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, up here. Can you stand up so everybody can hear it?
I have a question. I'm Laura Wilson from the Center for U.S. Global Engagement, and with the exception of what Susan just mentioned, I didn't hear either of the two of you talk very much about the need to not address in a military attack format the problems arise, but through foreign assistance, smart power approach that would elevate development to the same degree that we consider defense as part of our foreign policy and our way of interacting with the world. Could you each comment on your thoughts on that approach?
Well, I agree with that, and I've been advocating that, and I actually just founded a new think tank called the National Security Foreign Policy New Ideas Fund, and I hope we will be exploring those ideas. I think that was outside the scope of the discussion as we constituted. We tried to focus a little bit more on protecting America at home. But no, I agree totally with your sentiments.
Likewise. I mean, that's why I started with the comprehensive approach from the 9/11 Commission, which has 3 parts to it. One is to go after the terrorists. One is to go after the sea that they swim in and separate the Muslim populations from the terrorists. And the third is to protect the homeland. In the end, it's only in that area that this thing is going to change. protecting the homeland and trying to chop off the heads of terrorists are only holding actions until that ultimately can reverse what's going on in the Muslim world today. So I agree completely.
I do have two written questions, which I'll, first one's a tough one, so I'm going to give it to Susan and Rand. What's the best way to alleviate the climate of fear?
I think the polls have shown that it is happening, and I don't think that it is something that you can do overnight. What those people who are in the field and who report back say is the more people have become empowered, the less fear they feel. So if you put people out on the campaign trail and they're actually able to elect folks who speak for them, that feels good. If they're able to talk to their state legislators and make the kinds of things happen in their state, that also makes a difference, because you like to have a positive influence and you like to see that change is happening. I think for too many years after 9/11, again, we were paralyzed and the government was paralyzed as well. I heard something very interesting by a Republican right after the election when she was first voting on the minimum wage, and she said, "Oh, for the first time I'm able to vote my conscience."
I also think that providing the public with information about what's going on is one of the best antidotes to fear. We have, 50,000 people a year who are killed in automobile accidents. We've had a public discussion about what automobile safety involves, and people understand that, and people are prepared to deal or accept the fact that it is dangerous to drive on the highways, and certainly at a more catastrophic level in terms of casualties than anything that's happened to us, at least, from terrorism. So I think if the government can share real information and not have crazy things like the color code alert system in which we don't have the foggiest notion about what they're talking about when they say that we need to raise the alert level or to reduce the alert level. So information is an important contribution.
I have a slightly different approach, as you might suspect. I think there are things to be concerned about, and there are some very dangerous things facing America, both here and abroad. And it's not unrealistic for people to think about those things. I think people's fears would be somewhat allayed, however, if America was working to solve real security problems and not creating additional security problems. To some extent, that is happening. The public certainly, when it looks at Iraq, understands that we've made the world less safe for America, not more safe. If we spent a little bit more time doing many of the things that have been mentioned here by both the panel and the audience in addressing real issues of security, I think people would feel at least we're working towards solutions and not ignoring them or creating even more dangerous situations. That's a dense one to read. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I actually build national security platforms for
They can't hear back there.
I've actually read some things she's written.
as an indication of that. But the thing that worries me right now about the next election story about the use of force that doesn't go down the path of what Hillary Clinton has done, that's made her base so angry, which is to preempt Obama and everybody else by saying, we're just going to, bomb them, or that's where we have air power, or that is this sort of very comforting but completely wrong way to use our military. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on that, because I really think that's the toughest nut we have to crack, is to bring up the use of force for people's very legitimate fears, but not let that then eliminate the rest of the conversation about priorities.
Rand and Susan?
Caitlin's showing the sign for stop, but during the Central America struggles of the 80s, there were a lot of funders who got together and made it possible for there to be congressional debates all over the country about Central America. And I think that that's lacking now that we have a lot of groups that will have debates on the congressional level about all kinds of issues, but not on foreign policy, because mostly they're organized by state organizations. So I think that it is highly possible to do that, but it would require some money on the national level to do it, and to force the members of Congress to look at the foreign policy issues.
One of the great ironies of discussions in the federal government, where I spent most of my life, was that the strongest advocate in most councils against the use of force is the U.S. military. And the people who are most prepared to advocate in favor of prevention and spending money for it is the U.S. military. To some degree, they need to be part of the public conversation instead of just the private conversation.
We'll take one more quick question, if you can make it quick. Dorothy?
Well, I wonder, would you include in national security things like natural disasters and also what's happening to our defense against them, for example, by putting all the National Guard in Iraq? We don't have the National Guard here, who should be a prime line of defense.
Yeah.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Well, I think we would all agree with that, for sure.
Completely.
Completely. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.